So welcome everyone. Yes, I'm Laura Berlage of Erindale Tapestry Studio, tuning in from my farm in northern Wisconsin. And part of the impetus for this being a talk today is a class that I taught through Vesterheim that just wrapped up last month, Wise Virgin Tapestry. I've got an example of the piece that we did here. Amazing journey to share with students. That piece was inspired by pieces in the Vesterheim collection that are in the Wise and Foolish Virgin Tapestry theme. What is that theme and why was it popular? And as I was working on creating a version that we could weave at a student level, I found myself asking, and what are they wearing? Because clothing can tell us a lot about contemporary conditions and lived experiences of the people there. I became interested in the lived experiences of people throughout history when I believe it was third grade, that my Montessori school took a tour to Old World, Wisconsin, which is a living history campus with farms and houses and shops on a main street. And there are docents in costume that are enacting everyday activities of the people who lived there and sharing their stories. And I walked away thinking, history isn't just names and dates of dead people. These are real people who had real experiences. It's just in a different frame, if you will, because it was a different time. So I want to bring some of that living history aspect of what is behind these pieces, the people who wove them, the people who use them, to this discussion today. It helps to take a moment to step back and understand what era we're looking at and what was happening in Norway at that time. So if you English history, this is roughly the late Plantagenet, Tudor, and Stuart eras. At the time, Denmark and Norway were a united kingdom based out of Copenhagen in Denmark. That was in part because the Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian monarchies had quite a number of double marriages. So I'll marry your sister, you marry my sister. And eventually that created an heir who was the legitimate successor to more than one throne. This was all under the House of Oldenburg. While it wasn't always a direct primogeniture inheritance, it was the same dynasty throughout this period. So we're looking at 1500s, 1600s, early 1700s. As I was doing my research, I realized how much of a void my medieval studies had in Scandinavia. We hear about the Vikings, and then not a lot of Scandinavian history gets talked about in this particular time period. So I had to do some extra digging, which was particularly fun. During this time, the Kingdom of Denmark, Norway also owns Greenland and Iceland, and a variety of islands in which they are under contention with Scotland. So a great North Atlantic power, most of the power being in Denmark. So it was very influenced. We also should note that this is in the time period of the Reformation. So there's tremendous religious change in this region as well, going from Catholicism to Protestantism, which will influence the story later. The surviving tapestries that we have from Norway were originally, from this era, woven as coverlets. They were meant to go on beds rather than on castle walls, as tapestries were being made in other parts of continental Europe. And they had a powerful role to play in an important transitional point in a woman's life. They were part of your wedding. And the creation of this tapestry was a critical part of your dowry or part of the value that you took with you into your marriage. For the vast majority of women in rural Norway, this was a style of tapestry known as rutevev or square weave, as the example shows on the left. Geometric tapestries that are imbued with symbolism and protective imagery that had meaning to the people of the time. To a much lesser extent, there was also another technique, billedvev, which translates as picture weaving. And you can see that on the example of the right, where we have our wise and foolish virgin motif with our ladies wearing their crowns. While there are significantly fewer surviving tapestries than geometric tapestries for the region in this era, by far the largest number of motifs are of the wise and foolish virgin's story. And other stories like the Adoration of the Magi, Solomon's Wisdom, occupy a significantly smaller number of surviving pieces. So this story had meaning, it had impact for it to be chosen over and over and over again. Who made these pieces and how did they make them? Interestingly, even though floor loom technology was making its way into rural Norway in the era of our interests, you were not doing your tapestry on that loom. You saved that loom for production fabric so that you could clothe your family for the next year. Tapestry weaving, therefore, either was worked on your old warp-weighted loom that you had from your great-great-great-great-great-grandmother, or on specific tapestry looms like this one shown here. And as a contemporary tapestry weaver, when I look at some of these historic examples, I go, you really fought warp tension, didn't you? And when I found this picture, I was like, I can see why. Much more difficult looms to work with than a contemporary tapestry weaver has at her disposal. But you can see it is upright. They do have the two sheds. One is with a stick and one has leashes that you can pull forward to make the opposite shed, because classic tapestry only needs two sheds to be woven. In some cases, young women were expected to weave their own coverlet. In pictorial tapestry, however, this takes significantly longer to do than a geometric tapestry. So it was a significant investment in time. And some scholars believe some women were weaving their own pictorial tapestries, and some families had enough means to buy that tapestry for their daughter's dowry from an experienced tapestry weaver. A particular demographic that was available for this type of production, because textiles were definitely a female occupation in Norway versus the guilds system, which was heavily male dominated in at the same period in continental Europe. An interesting demographic is that this was a good occupation for widows who tended to have a more difficult time staying financially stable in this particular era. And we have a couple examples of women. I want to give you their names quick. Anne Petter's daughter, Bayer, and Joanne, Jen's daughter. Hope I'm getting those close. Both were in the 1590s burnt as witches in Bergen. And in those trial documents, they are listed as being professional tapestry weavers. And one was even teaching other young women how to weave. It's the earliest date we have of women tapestry weavers in Norway because of those records. How are these tapestries woven? Well, hello to all my students. tonight who joined me on the journey of the Wise Virgin Tapestry, but these are a couple images from the mock-up that I created for that. And it's a very slow, meticulous process. And often the weft threads, the colorful threads that go horizontally back and forth, they're doing this little dance around the rigid vertical warp threads. And as they do their little dance, they're interacting with the colors next to them. Sometimes they're locking together. Sometimes they're sharing a warp. It's a special dance with yarn that you get to learn to paint this beautiful picture. And everywhere you see a color, that's as far as that thread went. Versus other types of tapestry where the shuttle still goes all the way across. Tapestry weaving must be done meticulously by hand from the bottom to the top. Or as in many cases, as shown here in pictorial weaving, it was done from the side. So it's easier to work thin vertical elements as you would need with a series of human figures. What materials were used? Primarily wool for our Norwegian coverlets, not surprising considering that there was a lot of sheep raising going on at the time. And the breed that was the favorite at the time is a Spelsow sheep. You can see in the picture, they have these really long outer guard hair locks. And it's shiny because the individual scales of the fiber are also very long, so they can refract the light. Those outer hairs are very strong. And when they would shear the sheep in the spring and the fall, they would card the fluffy under hairs out so that they just had those long guard hairs. And that was spun certainly for warp, but also in the case of billedvev tapestry, it was used for the weft so that you got that shiny luster, which you can see in the tapestry at left. And this is also from the Vesterheim collection. This is one of the Magi tapestries. You can see how that shininess comes. It makes a very durable textile. All done by hand, the hours, it's just incredible. I also do Flemish style weaving, so I felt it was important to offer you a chance to see the differences in what tapestry was doing in the gilded centers in Flanders and in Paris versus what was happening in Norway. The King of Denmark had tried to set up guilds in southern Norway to make tapestries for the elite, the social elite. Complications of the plague and the mini ice age and other factors, those guilds fell apart. But some of the knowledge dispersed with the people into the community and was taken up by women weavers. It's important to understand, though, that not all of the style followed them. It got very regionally influenced by folk traditions, and the scale was different. So a typical coverlet for a bed is between 4 and 5 feet wide and 5 and 6 feet tall, give or take. Whereas a typical tapestry commission for a chateau is the height of a castle wall by how wide you want it to afford. So as your scale gets bigger, you have many, many more warps to choose from to make your image. And you can work in a more painterly fashion, as we see Narcissus looking at his reflection in the well at top. Versus when you have a more confined space, you have fewer choices in how many warps by how many wefts to paint your image. What I love about the Norwegian tapestries is they are so efficient at packing in as much as they can at the scale that they are working. It has a very approachable sense to it. It's not aloof. It's available. In many of the scholarly works that I was going through as part of preparing this presentation, it was noted how uniform this style of motif is. But the more time that I spent with resources online and in books, what popped out for me were the variations, were the differences. Because those tell us a story too. Tapestry is a series of 1,000 choices. Every single strand is a choice. Every turnaround is a choice. And the individual choices of these individual weavers gets really interesting for me. For instance, we have ornate backgrounds and borders, or we have simple backgrounds and borders, or we have, like on the one in the lower right here, look at the top row of figures. We have legs. Isn't that fun? So the choices that those individual weavers make come out, and the various lineages of who did they study with and what types of techniques were in their toolkit comes forward. Definitely not a one-size-fits-all. So I want to move from the weavers and their situation to the story that we're looking at now. Because this gets interesting, and I want you to step out of your contemporary understanding of social situations, and I want you to try to step into the shoes of a woman living in, say, the early 1600s or the late 1590s. It's a different place, but it's worth jumping into for the sake of understanding why this story, why this tapestry. Because the property of maidenhood was an extremely defining part of who you were as a woman versus matrimony and motherhood. And you see it all the time in the literature, in the ballads, in the folk tales, how important knowing, maiden or not, is in these stories. And sometimes it is the only defining character. In a tapestry class earlier today, I was sharing the story of the three aunts, and the main protagonist is simply called the maiden. She didn't even get a name survive with her in that Norwegian folktale. Or we see it in songs all the time. I forbid you, maiden soul, that wear gold in your hair, to come or go by Carter Hall, for young Tamerlane is there. The concept of Ms. did not exist in the era of our study. The other thing that did not exist was the concept of the history of dress. And you'll notice that the wise and foolish virgins, which this is based on a biblical verse, it's Matthew 25 from the New Testament, are not wearing biblical clothing. Just as in this illustration, roughly contemporary, a little bit era later, also are not wearing biblical clothing. They're wearing what is fashionable of the day. To give you a synopsis of what this story is based on, it is important to understand that in the Reformation, something that is kind of new to the ordinary person in rural life is the translation of biblical verse into the vernacular, rather than Latin, which is how it was predominantly in Catholicism's time. So more people are getting more access to reading verse on their own. And certain stories start to jump out at them. It is important to put these stories into context and understand who's talking to who and why. So Matthew 25, this is on the Mount of Olives. It's Jesus speaking. He has recently gone to Jerusalem, all the palms, woohoo, we're excited you're here. And then he starts telling the religious elite things they don't want to hear. They're pissed off at him. He retreats to the Mount of Olives. It's not going to be very long before he's betrayed by Judas. His disciples are there, and they're getting rather worried about the situation. And they're asking him really big questions. You say you're coming back. When are you coming back? How is that going to work? What's it going to look like? How will I know when that is? These are pretty big concepts. And Jesus, in his usual fashion, answers them with stories, illustrative stories, trying to use examples from things that these people will recognize from their life. This particular parable has to do with who gets into the kingdom of heaven, and it's in a whole series of different examples. So he says, it will be like 10 maidens waiting on a wedding ceremony, and they're waiting for the bridegroom, and they're waiting, and they're waiting, and they're waiting, and they're waiting, and they fall asleep. And then suddenly the bridegroom arrives to take them to the wedding. It's in the middle of the night. Nobody can see anything. And they have oil lamps. 5 of the maidens were wise. They brought oil for their lamps so they could light them, so they could see. The other 5 didn't bring any oil. They were foolish. And the 5 that were foolish go to the wise ones and go, could I borrow some of your oil, please? And the wise ones go, no. If I share with you, there won't be enough for either of us, and then nobody gets to go. Go to town, go buy some oil, and then join the party. So off they go, the foolish ones, to go buy oil. It's in the middle of the night. Nothing's open. There's no quick trip for oil lamps. In biblical times. So it takes a while to get oil. And by the time they get oil and they get back to the party, the doors are sealed. And the bridegroom goes, I don't even know who you guys are. Because you can't get into the kingdom of heaven borrowing someone else's spiritual work. You have to do your own work. That's the religious context. We need to shift our understanding of why is this important in the tapestry by secularizing the story. How that story shows up in the tapestries is an important skill to learn how to read, because so often tapestries will show us multiple scenes at once. And just like when you're reading, you start at the top left and work your way down. So at the top left, in the image at the left, and this is a beautiful piece in the Westerheim collection, please see it if you go. We have Christ on the left and the 3 wise virgins holding their lamps up. At the bottom, we have the 5 foolish virgins crying into their kerchiefs and the oil seller. So that's how you read the story. And as we go, you'll see how we lose some of those characters. So the tapestry telling this biblical story for women getting married. This was part of your marriage ceremony, was to have this tapestry up, either behind the couple or they stood on it on the floor. And it's about good comes to those who are prepared versus ill comes to those who are not prepared. And we need to put that in the context of climate change. And that has to do with the mini ice age. It dramatically impacted the North Atlantic. Things were stormier, crops failed, a volcano in Iceland erupted, and the contemporary journals record there was no sun for 3 summers. Greenland fails and is deserted, or the people die. Iceland barely hangs on. Norway is on the edge of where people could even live through a winter. And the plagues have decimated the population. So if you're from a family that can afford to either spend the time to make billedvev tapestries or to buy billedvev tapestries, you're in the haves of your social caste. And moralizing tales for young women are everywhere in this era. They're on embroidery designs, they're in prayer books, they're in the stories and the songs that they would have seen and heard. As a folklorist, I know that the stories that get repeated and therefore survive are the stories felt to have an important lesson in them. So if you're of the haves, being prepared in a time of climate crisis is going to help you stay there and not become a have-not, which makes the bit about, will you share? No, there won't be enough. Get a little edgy, doesn't it? Wise and foolish version story is everywhere in medieval and Renaissance art. It is only in Norway that it's in tapestry. That's pretty remarkable. I've looked at a lot of religious tapestries, and that theme is special to Norway. We'll shift gears again. I want to talk about clothing. Clothing is one of the biggest things represented in these pieces past the story. And remember, it's not historic clothing, as in biblical clothing, because the concept of the history of dress hadn't evolved yet. So we can learn about the era that these were woven in through the clothing represented in the tapestries. Fashion is very important. It tells a lot about who you are. Especially historic dress had a lot of coded language in it. And I really tried hard to bring forward images in this part of the talk that are specific to Denmark, Norway, or we have a few stand-ins from England and Scotland, and they were all very connected, especially through the marriage of Anne of Denmark to James I, right in this era that we're looking at. This is Queen Sophia of Denmark. She was a German duchess before she became queen. She's the mother of Anne of Denmark, very lavishly dressed in red velvet and gold, and of course, lots of pearls. She was a big pearl fan, befitting a queen. Clothing wasn't just what you liked. It followed the fashions as best you could afford, and it was a coded language of who you were, socially, economically, your marital status, either your work or your spouse's work. I love this painting of bourgeois women in Denmark, Norway. 3 of them are married. 1 of them is not. I know I can't get live guesses on a webinar as to which is which, but I'll give you a hint. It's not the one in black. She may be in mourning for a loved one. Notice who gets to show her ears. Yes, she's the one that is still available as marriage material. These are daughters of a goldsmith. So they are very well attired. And in many of the countries or kingdoms of Europe in this period had lots and lots of rules about who could wear what, and every monarch adjusted those rules and updated them. There were significantly fewer of these rules, they're called sumptuary laws, in the Kingdom of Denmark, Norway, than say in England or in Scotland. So if you stayed away from precious jewels, you could afford it, you could wear it, other than a few certain colors. So we can see goldsmiths' daughters dressing like princesses. Kind of unique to this region. And as I was studying the clothing, oh my goodness, I ran into some of the most beautiful things. This is at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and there's gold work and there's embroidery. People really put a lot of their finances in their clothing. It was an important part of their wills. It was how you could show off what wealth you had, or to make things special with embroidery with your own hand, even if you didn't have a lot of wealth to pay someone else to do it. And these things were meant to last. It was not a throwaway society like we have today. Let's take a quick tour of fashions by social ranks. So we have our nobles at the very top. More the aristocracy in Denmark, Norway lived in Denmark than in Norway, but there were a few social elites for them to see. Fashions change very fast. It's very much influenced by what is popular in Paris and in Rome. A lot of very quick wardrobe changes. Then you bump down to the bourgeoisie elite. Denmark, Norway was a big epicenter for trade, and there was a lot of merchant class, most of which were German. So there is a very strong German fashion influence in this particular group. A lot of wealth. This is what's going to eventually become middle class as that starts to develop and as capitalism really starts to take over the old feudalist processes in Europe. Then we'll drop to the bottom. We've got our everyday folks, who probably most of us, that's where our ancestors came from. And the fashions don't change as much. They are much more stable, little tweaks and variations as you go, very much about being functional and more comfortable than the elite fashions. The accents tend to be in small ways that you could afford or that you could add to your clothing. So you could have nicer things given to you in a will if you had a relationship with an elite. Then we'll bump up to one place up from there. This particular social group is the Yeoman Farmer, or a wealthier landowning farmer. The Danish aristocracy hit a rough spot financially, and they sold a lot of Norway's land to individual farmers in the late medieval period. So these yeoman farmers were land owning. They owned their own land. This is kind of special for a lot of early modern Europe. So they had fewer taxes to pay with regards to certain things, and they could start to accumulate wealth. So while Norway was certainly not a wealthy country, as far as looking at what other European countries were in financially at this time, but individuals could accumulate a little more wealth as landowners, rather than simply being part of an estate that a noble person owns and you're just renting the land. Scholars believe that this is the subgroup that was buying or making the Wise and Foolish Virgins tapestries. It is so much harder to find out things about this particular subgroup. So I knew I had to go and find some experts. This is not the first time I've been interested in what are women wearing in tapestries. Several years ago, I did a research deep dive into what the women in the Lady and the Unicorn tapestries in Paris are wearing. Much bigger tapestries, a lot of detail, a little easier to read what's going on. And that's when I crossed paths with the ladies of the Tudor Tailor, Jane Malcolm Davies and Ninja Michaela in London and Copenhagen. So I knew it was time to reach out again, because this is their era expertise as far as recreating authentic clothing and looking at what we have in these images. I do want to note that I'm looking at historic dress, which is a divergent path from festive folk dress. A lot of what we understand now about festive folk dress comes out of fashions that were slowly developing in the 1800s, and there's a romanticist layer on it. So if that's where your brain is going, just bookmark that spot for a later date. We're interested in the historic dress based on the changes in fashions in this particular era, some of which ended up influencing those folk costumes. But we have a different road we're on. As a tapestry weaver, this put me in a unique spot as far as researching the dress, because I have a detail what you can and can't weave, especially at the scale, and being able to look at that and interpret how was fashion being represented in tapestry at this scale got really interesting. Let's look at some of the fashions we see. Ruffs and the little headshots at the bottom. Robbie Lafleur, thank you so much for taking these pictures at Vesterheim. This is from one of their pieces, and you can see all these characters with this sort of zigzag thing. And those are ruffs. This is a pleated collar. And that was a major statement of wealth because they had to be starched. And if you're living in an era where there are crop failures and there are famines, the fact that you could use food to make your clothing stiff instead of eat it was a conspicuous way to demonstrate your wealth. You also had to keep that thing clean. Like that was a deal. Bridal crowns. Sometimes I have people say, "Oh, I love your princess tapestry." It's not really a princess. So specific to Norway, there is a tradition of wearing a crown as the bride in your wedding, and it's a nod to the goddess Freya and her love of gold and jewels. Later, it was said that that was for the Virgin Mary, but we all know that she took on a lot of the aspects of old goddesses as a part of making Christianity more palatable in the transition period in the 700s, 800s, 900s. And this crown belonged to the village, and you got to wear it on your special day. Some regions it's silver, some regions it's gold, but that's why the maidens are wearing crowns, because they are the brides. I did hit one bumpy spot, and that was interpreting the panel at the front of the main skirt. Is it an apron? Is it a split skirt? My initial reaction was it must be a split skirt, because that was what I was familiar with from my studies in English and French fashions of this era. But I kept finding conflicting data. And Jane and I really went back and forth on this one, Jane from the Tudor Tailor. And we suspect that it was originally based off of a split skirt. So you had a very expensive fabric that you revealed a little bit at the front by splitting open the overskirt. That's slightly suggestive, but another conspicuous way to show what you could afford. And later, as fashions changed, it may have gotten confused as being a decorative apron. That is the closest we're getting on our theories with that one. So every little detail in these tapestries are choices weavers made, including, look at the tapestry here in the lower left. This is from MIA, the Minneapolis Institute of Art. And there's all these little black lines on the ladies' bodices. And those might be either welts or guards, which was bits of black velvet that you added to your outfit to help protect seams and highlight your figure and make something extra special. You couldn't afford the whole thing to be velvet, but if you could afford these little strips, it sparked up your outfit. And we also see wings. So these are special shoulder parts. Sometimes they're serrated, sometimes they're padded, and that could be used to make your shoulders look wider, but also to hide things like the cords that tied your sleeve on. Sleeves could be detachable. And you might have an evening sleeve and a workaday sleeve. You could spice up your outfit that way. So we see these little details telling us about pieces of these garments that's very special. Oh, this one is fun because once you see these things, you can't unsee them. Pinking. Pinking is interesting. So here's a way to flaunt your wealth. I can buy silk and I can put tiny little cuts in it. It was a fashion. Now, it started with leather, which makes the leather more breathable and more supple, but you can also do it with silk. And there's a way that you stamp it to make those little cuts. And we can see that here in this tailor's doublet is pinking all over it. And then look at that tapestry in the upper left. The lady in the yellowy cream bodice. All those little tiny black lines, like that was a lot of work to weave that. That was on purpose. I think that that's a representation of pinking, which tells you about her wealth, that she could afford silk and afford to have little cuts put into it for fashion's sake. Buttons and closures. In some of the tapestries, and you can see it on the blue lady here, there's a little bit of pick and pick or hag's teeth or coal mining. There's lots of different names for that particular technique. Tricky to do at that scale on a pictorial piece. It's like showing us that she's got a row of buttons at the front of her bodice. Or these little tiny lines. We have attention to detail added in these tapestries about how you got into them or how they were decorated. I think that's fun to see. And shaping. When I found this tapestry pillow cover in the archives of Norwegian museums, this lower row, look at this. The ladies are in slight profile. That is unique. Most of the time we just see them straight on. And you can see that her bodice is straight at the front and it flares out over her butt. Right. And there sometimes were padded undergarments called a bum roll that you could wear under your skirt to give yourself a little more lift if you needed it. And we can see that here in that piece from the Victoria and Albert. We can see that flat front and the flared back. So it's giving us hints about what's happening in these fashions. Some of the skirts are more straight, which you could just do with a few petticoats and a curdle and layer them up. And some of them have definite more bell shapes. And that could be created through a variety of different fashions at the time, including the farthingale. The Spanish farthingale gave you more of a cone shape. Think like a hoop skirt, but a little more minimalist than what we saw in the American Civil War. And there are a variety of ways you could stiffen that. And you could get a tinier waist appearance through stays or bodies. So these are early versions of corsets. Can't lace them too tight because the metal eyelet hasn't been invented yet and you'll tear your thread eyelets out. But you can adjust the figure to get more of this accentuated hourglass look. Post Spanish farthingale, we get the French farthingale. It's kind of like a hula hoop off of your waist with smaller hula hoops inside, and it makes the skirt go out and then down. And that particular posture change in the wearers. See those ladies and those Danish nobles and how they have to hold their arms to navigate this French farthingale? And then look at the women in the tapestries and how they're holding their arms for the style where it goes out and then straight down. Those are choices those weavers made. And it's fun to think that it may give us some hints into fashions and how they migrated into rural Norway. This piece, this is really interesting. So as I was in conversation with Jane and Loran, and we're passing articles and books back and forth, there is a regional garment of interest, and that is the knitted waistcoat or the nattwøye. I hope I got that right. Which translates as night robe or night shirt. not night as in you go to bed, but just like a nightcap. So your dress when you were at work or when you were at court, very confining, not very comfortable. You finally get home. You want to get into something comfortable, just like we do now when we get home from work. And these knitted outfits were very sumptuous, but were way more comfortable than the tight things that you were considered presentable outside of them. They're an interesting New York thing in the Nordic countries and in Scotland, but remember, lots of cross-pollination there, especially with the marriage of Anne of Denmark. And they don't have wings, and they don't have guards, and they don't have all these heavy seaming that we see, but they were often knitted with the 8-pointed star, 8-petaled rose, and fertile fields, which is 4 diamonds in a diamond. This lady here, this is from the Tapestry at Mia. She has a softer garment. There's no distinctive seams for her sleeves, and there's no wings. It's a very soft, and there's little tiny stars. This may be one of our only representations of this particular outfit in tapestry weaving, so that's pretty special. And the story, right, if we go back to the original story, they've been waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting through the night for Christ to come. So maybe she was wearing her more comfortable at home outfit. In a best of all worlds situation, I would have taken this research and decided to make something that I could wear, but I didn't have that kind of time or materials at my disposal. So I decided to do some experimental archaeology and try to make something like this on a small scale, on a doll scale. And I started with a series of drawings trying to interpret what I was seeing in the tapestries and draw it out like you might for costume design when you're doing a theatrical production or other types of instances, and trying to deconstruct what are the pieces. And I got a version A shown here, more of an earlier styles of fashion. And then I got a version B shown here with a little later styles of fashion that I was seeing represented as I was interpreting these historic pieces. And the Tudor Tailor has a wonderful variety of books. I have 3 of them, including the Typical Tudor and the Tudor Tailor and Queen's Servants. And I was able to use the drafted patterns at the scale that they were in the book. And then I made a doll to fit the scale of that. So I could start to cut things out and stitch them on and see how does this look as you put the layers together. So I needle felted this adorable little doll with wire armature using wool from our sheep and started cutting and stitching and crafting. And my goodness, at that scale, it was really something. She's only 9 inches tall. We don't really know what people were wearing, if anything, under their smock or their shirt. So I started at that layer. So we're going to start at the bottom and work our way out to the outer garments. Getting dressed was more of a deal in the morning than it is today. I loved the theory of this knitted waistcoat. In some instances, I was seeing it as outerwear, and in some instances, I was seeing it as an underlayer that your gown went over to help you stay warmer. That sounds useful in a mini ice age. And it kind of fits because the Norwegian sweater was originally also something you wore underneath other things. It wasn't outerwear. So you can see there's a lineage starting there. It was considered very appropriate to wear red near your body. That was considered healthy. It's the color of blood, and it was supposed to help prevent fevers. I don't know if it actually worked, but hey, if it made them feel better about it, go for it. So above those undergarments, we have the Curdle. And the Curdle is typically attached sleeveless bodice and skirt. Lots and lots of variations. It could be stiffened, as I did here. You could wear your stays under your Curdle in later fashions, I chose to go with something a little simpler than trying to make a miniature corset. And this could be lined with fur or lambskin when it was very cold to help give you even more warmth inside. Because nothing was heated, so they lived in a much colder environment in colder times of the year than we do. And then starting to put the outer layers on, we've got a skirt. This is where I was experimenting with the apron option. Then I went to our waistcoat. I learned that velvet is not your friend at this scale. Oh my goodness, never again. But I went start to finish. And I also put some black ribbon over the seams in his trim to help mimic some of those guards or welts. Then we've got her ruff. I found some pleated antique lace that looked fun for that. Gave her a little bit for her kerchief. Seems to be a very important accessory in these tapestries. Even for the wise ones, they usually have their kerchief with them. And then we add the crown and the lamb. But I wasn't quite satisfied. I really wanted to try out version B. So I took off the velvet top and I took off the apron and I opened up the front of the skirt and created a decorative damask panel to go underneath. Now, on a full scale, this would be a whole nother skirt with the decorative panel at the front, but I was running out of room on this little lady to make this all fit. So I just tucked it up inside and tacked it to the curdle. Adding more layers and decorative ribbon. I saw a lot of decorative trims depicted on the outer skirts of the women in these tapestries, which was a nice way to show off a smaller amount of something that you had made or had bought that was special. Then I went for a red silken doublet. And in place of having those buttons on the front, I used little golden beads. The skirt below the doublet may have been attached to the doublet, or it may have been separate. There seems to be variations because sometimes they're the same color and sometimes they're not in the tapestries. At this scale, I put them on separately because that's what I could get to fit. But this material was much nicer to work with than the velvet. I was able to get it better form fitting and better flare at the back, as shown in the originals. I even got little wings on the shoulders. So there she is with her crown and her lantern. She is ready for the festivities. It's helpful when you're weaving a tapestry not to just be copying shapes. It's helpful to know what you're trying to represent, and that can inform the decisions that you make as a weaver. Those weavers got to actually see those fashions walking around in their real lives. At least the early ones did. This is where I want to potentially offer something to the conversation about these tapestries, and that is a different way to think about how to date them. That is a real conundrum. Some of the pieces that I looked at from Norway had a 200-year date range. Some of them had a tighter date range, but what that was based on wasn't very convincing. And some of them have dates on them, but the scholars say, don't pay attention to that. We believe there was a lot of copying of older pieces going on, and they may have copied the dates. So it gets very confused. And I want to offer a way that we can group these pieces based on looking at stylistically what's happening and how that relates to the fashions and how that relates to the story and to the history of tapestry weaving in Norway. As I was looking at these pieces, I started sketching. I started sketching different trends in fashion that I was seeing. And it helped me start to come up with an early, middle, late essence. I do believe there are older pieces than what have survived, because some of the fashions represented may be earlier than the dates that we have. And we know women were weaving tapestries because of those names of those women that were burnt. The early style. Now remember, there was an attempt to set up Flemish style tapestry guilds in southern Norway that eventually failed. These pieces have more of that Flemish flavor. See the ornate borders with animals and fruits and flowers. We have backgrounds that have a scenic value. There's a garden, there's a cityscape, there's more things happening with greater depth and complexity. Sometimes it gets a little scrambled, a little hard to tell exactly what's going on, but we can see there's an attempt to follow that style a little bit more. We also see more individuality in the characters. Their different heights, their fashions have other variations, their expressions have other variations. Different choices going on, a little more dynamic. Then we get into what I think of as the late early. The Vesterheim older piece fits in here. And we've lost flowers and fruits and animals in the border, and we've gone to something more geometric. We have our star roses and sort of scallopy, viney serrations going through. There is still an element of scenicness to the background, but it's starting to get kind of scrambled. We don't have something that we can say, and that's a garden, or that's a city. We have, well, it might be a city. There's a crenellated wall background, and then we've got sort of this stripy thing and this checkered thing. So it becomes a little bit of a telephone game where you whisper something to someone and then they whisper it to the next and they whisper it to the next. And by the time you get to the end, it's not anything like what you started with. It gets a little bit of image decay from the original concept. Then we get to the middle. This is where things start to get kind of interesting. And you sometimes see Christ is Christ. Sometimes Christ is the devil. He has hooves for feet. I'm not sure where that flip came from. But look at the women on the left here. The ones with black headdresses, that's a headdress for married women. Versus the crowns are for the brides. What's happening to the story? Interesting. And the scenic background is getting replaced with more common folk motifs or geometric elements. By the time we get to the late style, we've almost lost the story completely. The groom and the oil seller are gone. And we've lost all of the attempts at inscriptions about there were 10 virgins, 5 were foolish and 5 were wise. And it's been completely replaced with geometric motifs. And here it starts to feel like instead of it being a representation of a biblical story, we have ancestors in procession. We also get that change in posture. And there are many, many variations outside of the norm, which are their own interesting study as well. Post this era, in the early 1900s, there was a revival in interest in billedvev tapestry in Norway. And Vesterheim has another lovely piece, that's the lower one in this example, from that era. And that inspired the piece that I wove with my students. You can see some of that fashion carries, and some of it gets adjusted and adapted. The women are holding tulips instead of oil lamps. So stories change as we change, and our situations change. It is interesting that we find ourselves in a climate crisis today, not in a cooling, but in a warming place. And maybe that story of preparedness will be important to us again as we navigate our current location in time. And if any of this interests you, I have an ongoing bibliography that I keep on my studio website. The link is at the bottom there, where you can find the resources that I used for my research and for prior research into this type of topic and tapestry and the era and culture. So if you want to travel anywhere down the rabbit hole, I don't even think it's a rabbit hole. I think it's a prairie dog village at this point. If you want to travel any of that, feel free to use those resources and continue your own journey. And I do want to offer a special thank you to everyone who helped me along the way and the resources that were there for visual aid for this presentation today. Thank you for making those available online so we can all learn about our heritage and the people who have come before us. Because it's important to know what it was like for our ancestors, because we can learn from them. Thank you.
Wow, fabulous. Well, Laura, we are running short on time, but we are going to throw you just a couple questions. Lorraine, you had one come in about the inscriptions. Is that right?
Right. You touched on this just a little bit at the end, but could you say something more about the inscriptions that we were seeing on some of the tapestries?
Right. And that's really interesting because sometimes they're right side forward and sometimes they're flipped. And you're looking at the letters backwards. It was considered that there was a lot of copying going on. And if you were illiterate, how would you know if you put the letters on backwards? But it usually says there were 10 virgins, 5 were wise and 5 were foolish. And then it might have a date. But again, we don't know if the dates are reliable because that may have been copied from earlier versions as well. That's typically what it says, or something close to that.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Great. Another question came in about the nightshirt, and knowing that the virgin's handkerchief is down. Am I right that this is a foolish virgin? And the question is, if that's a foolish virgin, is wearing the nightshirt further proof that she was unprepared for the arrival?
She's a wise virgin. She's actually standing right next to Christ. So this is a little visual device. This is Christ. And we know that because her lamp is up. If kerchief is down and lamp is up, she is wise. If kerchief is up and lamp is down because it's empty, then she's foolish. So she's a wise one. She also has a bridal veil. This is considered a veil, not her hair here. And because she's right next to Christ, that usually means she is considered preeminent in the story. And it may be a representation of the woman that was getting married. So it may have been tailored to be a little bit more like her or not. It's a little hard to know. But as far as the storytelling image, she would have been considered the most important character because she's right next to Christ.